please welcome our speakers. We will start with quick introductions and then we will share the format and the agenda for our session. Steve, would you like to go first?
Hi, folks. I'm Steve. I'm an engineer by training. I've been working in design systems for about 7 years now. I'm based in France. I currently work for France Télévisions, which is our equivalent of a BBC. So I've worked at Back Market before. I've talked at conferences here on A/B testing design systems. I usually like to talk about scalability and like automated approaches to design systems.
Thank you, Steve, for sharing. Erik, would you like to go next?
Hi, I'm Erik Goens. I am a senior product designer at a company called Thumbtack, senior product designer for design systems on our design systems product, thumbprint.design. I've been doing design systems work for around 7 years now as well, located in, I'll say, the greater Seattle area. Anyone from around here will probably contest that, but up in Bellingham, metropolitan speak, I'm probably secretly Canadian, closer to Vancouver, Vancouver, Canada, than Seattle itself. But yeah, been, again, working about 7 years in design systems, have a passion for bridging design and engineering to deliver effective experiences.
Thank you, Erik. NJ, our DJ, would you like to go next?
Hey there, I'm Andrey. I'm currently a design manager at a company called Beamery. It's a HR tech scale-up. Before that, worked in a mixture of like scale-ups and big tech companies. I've been with design systems for 7-ish years. I think we all started about the same time. I worked mostly on either design or product ownership side of design systems to help establish them from scratch and prove the ROI. Excited to be here. And I'm based in London.
Thank you. My name is Farid. I'm working at EPAM as Senior Design Ops, and I'm community advocate at Figma, Coda, and Infa. Really happy and excited to see all of you. Today, we're trying a new format called Inspect and Reflect. We will share our knowledge and experience with the participants in ways how you can actually do the design system inventory, understand some inconsistencies, how we group things, how we name things, what kind of variants we need to have for the components to make sure that the product teams can actually use the design system we are creating. Let's get started with 3 quick questions. The first question is, my organization has a dedicated design system team. And you can vote here on the left as strongly disagree or strongly agree by clicking on this alignment scale. The second question is, our design system supports multiple products across our organization. And the third question is, we have built a design system but are struggling with its adoption. And we can hear it from many people. Let me reveal the results. Steve, do you see some insights here based on the votes?
I think it's not too much of a surprise. But a word of caution, everything that we're going to say, all 3 of us today, we do work with a dedicated team. Maybe we can think about what we would do from the other perspective if we were on the other side, because the tools and methods would be different for sure. You want to be a lot more scrappy and have a lot less recurring costs when you don't have a team.
Situation where we did have a dedicated team in both of my most recent companies and moved to not having ones. That's actually... And I think this is true for many people out there when you kind of lose the funding or you have to reallocate resources somewhere. So you need to be able to do both.
Any thoughts on the results?
Similar to what Andrey said previously, Thumbtack was in a situation where they had to do a reduction in workforce, but that ultimately led to a team later, which is me as a dedicated design system individual with contributions coming from a team. So more of a federated model where we can get engineers and designers to contribute a portion of their time. There is a resource, but yeah, maybe it's not 100% for an entire team.
So the session that we are testing today, it's called Inspect and Reflect. And the format is, I took it from Design System Inventory Workshop template. Here's the link if you would like to see it in more details. But the core idea here is how we can take one product, in our case, Pinterest, and see how their design system components are being used within the product. We will discuss different strategies if you are struggling with adoption, or if your components are not being utilized across the whole organization. We created screenshots of product sitemap for unauthorized users and product sitemap for authorized users. The core part of this product sitemap is for you to quickly understand the product context and go into the main pages. If we're talking about a specific component family, you will be able to go deeper and see exactly where this component is being used. Let's start with the first component set called accordion. While we are discussing that, feel free to look into Pinterest and find any variations of accordion component. Add your screenshots here in this component view section so we can all collaborate. If you find something new, please share. It will be interesting to see. And also you can use Chrome extension if you would like. It gives you the ability to crop the screenshot as the component itself and pull the code preview as well. It will give you more insights rather than just cropping the screenshots. We would like to talk about the accordion. I can highlight the main component itself and how Pinterest is talking about this accordion. Then one of the speakers could go through the component views and share their thoughts. So accordion is the container that can be explained and expanded and collapsed to show content about a single subject. Its contents can be visible at all times or expand and collapse as an individual item or a group of items. I really like the way how Pinterest is also documenting, also known as section, expandable section, model, disclosure, stack view, and expander. It also helps with the searchability within Figma if you're adding this kind of also known as in the component description. Here are the different variants that they've documented. The static with icon buttons, with some badges on the side, the error messages, and some other variations. Here are 4 component views that we were able to find within the product. Steve, would you like to go first?
Yeah, sure.
And share your thoughts?
So I just wanted to bounce back on the naming. This component is so commonplace that it's been standardized in HTML very recently, and it's called details. It's interesting here to see that we have this little code. Some of them are a bit different from each other. The 4th one really stands out. It's been built probably later and separately. We can see that it's slightly better in terms of accessibility because it has the proper rules and semantics to explain that it's an accordion to people using a screen reader. So I usually look at the code rather than the UI because it tells me more about how things are built. And here I can see for sure that there are at least 2 that exist. There's a small chance that the one on the left is different as well. It's possible that it's just been customized. This inline style here is kind of a good indicator that someone has tried to adjust a component's looks to a specific use case because like they couldn't do it with the component as it was produced. So this is usually something to reflect upon. But I can also see that there are a few more changes that were made. It's possible that someone got the results of an accessibility audit on this page specifically, and they fixed it on this page specifically, and they didn't think to share it with the design system team. This is also something that I find is interesting when there are unusual properties on a component that is still the same component. In this case, I'm not sure because the typography is so different, and I'm not really sure which one it is.
Steve, so from your comment, I took 3 main insights. The first one is HTML standards. This is my first time, like I've seen it in other places, but can you share a link or something? And what is your take on that? Should design system folks always take HTML standards as a foundation and then build on top of that? And
Absolutely.
Why it's important?
I'm sharing it here because it's built right. Even if it's a little less powerful than what you would like, this is exactly what screen reader developers are going to be using as a standard. And we always say no ARIA is better than bad ARIA. So ARIA is the APIs that we use to provide additional information for accessibility technologies. And we don't want to provide it when there's already a standard well-defined behavior. This details component, I've built it. You need to have JavaScript to build it. It's a bit of work. You can make mistakes, absolutely. You can have performance issues as well. The fact that it's built in the web browsers means a lot of that is just going to go away and it's going to behave well. Consistency is more important if you have a wide audience than looking unique for this kind of components. So that would be for the first question. Do you want to bounce back on the style customizations?
What's your take on that? Is it okay for product teams to do the customization, or what is the red line from your perspective? What kind of styles should be pulled into the design system?
look, we should call the brand police and throw them in a cell. How dare they? Our component was perfect. You have to reflect on why it happens. There can be cases where, like, your hand is forced. I've had extreme cases with government projects where we are asked to not respect the brand guidelines because someone has decided that it needs to be different. If you have a stakeholder that has made a decision and is forcing it on their team, if you're inflexible, then the team's just going to be stuck between a rock and a stone, right? So you don't want that. But you need to understand why this is done and when it's legitimate and when it's people maybe wanting to go too far in terms of differentiation. There's definitely value to consistency in the way interactions are managed. If someone wanted to change hover styles, focus outlines, or the way the icon is represented or animated, that would bother me. It makes it harder for the entire user journey to recognize the different components and use them. But if someone wanted to change things related to layout concerns, referring that possibility might make the component more flexible.
No interaction overrides, but styles related to layout are okay.
Yeah, okay is always a spectrum, right? I would say that there are things that are detrimental and there are things that are more like matter of fact.
I'm curious to hear thoughts from Andrey and Erik. What are your thoughts on this style customization from design perspective, from Figma perspective?
As we pointed out already, sometimes they're justified. Sometimes you need to introduce a little bit of flexibility because if you don't, then people will start deviating anyways, but they will do this in more undesirable ways. Introducing this flexibility when it's needed is acceptable. However, it's a question whether you always need to introduce this flexibility into component, or you can experiment outside of the component in some safe environment and then bring this in where it's actually validated. Also, when looking just across these options that you brought in, I would say that some of these fall into the variability where you have like multiple properties within your component. You need to allow for multiple use cases. And the one on the right, the most robust or well-built one, it feels very different. This has been built without looking at the other options. This cannot fall into the category of style customization. This is a completely different thing because even the pattern that is used is different. You're using plus icon instead of the chevron, which is more significant than just variations in the font style. So I would be cautious of these types of things. The difficulty is that they almost always introduce some tech debt. It's all right to allow some customization, but you need to capture this somewhere. Because as soon as it starts spreading across your organization, it's really hard to catch these things and then to realize whether or not this is our acceptable way of doing this component going forward, or this is just a one-off thing.
The interesting part about this last component, I found it on the business.pinterest.com. So it looks like it's completely different product, right? Maybe even like the tech stack is completely different. Maybe they are using some kind of content generation platform like Webflow. So that's why they are not able to use the components. But in that kind of cases, right, when you are part of this design system team and you can see other products within organizations are not following the design system guidelines, what are your next steps as a brand police, as Steve mentioned?
If we're thinking of this as an experiment within a separate business entity where the use cases of their customers are not always intersecting with the use cases of the rest of the organization, that could be fine because your design system should enable others. So moreover, I can even, like you brought Webflow, and this is actually a good example where they might have created this as a quick experiment. They didn't have resources to design this using the system or the same tech stack as everyone else. And that's why they used the solution that would allow them to quickly validate this with customers. On the bright side, they're getting a component that is more accessible, and potentially they will actually spread this pattern back, like feedback to the design system. They will realize that this works well for us. This consistency is justifiable because the use cases are not crossing. Just final thing that I want to point out on the accessibility side of things is If we're thinking of this as a business use case, sometimes the B2B or B2B enterprise would have slightly different requirements when it comes to accessibility. They have to build this to a certain level of compliance, whereas others can be a little bit more flexible, relaxed about that.
I'm curious, how would you solve this problem? In our organization, we have multiple different departments. Some of them might not even know that we have a design system. As a recommendation for all the listeners, if they have the same issue, what will be your action items?
Well, I'll piggyback off what Andrey was saying. It really depends on the location of this instance and where it belongs. If it's a part of the core product, that might be a conversation we have sooner rather than later. I would tackle this in the way of that when we're doing any bit of an audit, we have a separate Figma file that we're collecting each one of these. For every component in the system, there's a separate component file. So we'll capture some of those audits and we'll put it within that file and use that as a kind of a way to earmark, similar to what we were saying before about tracking some of those usage patterns and trying to understand the differences between the component usage and intended usage. And then using this as a moment to connect with other teams, trying to understand what their intentions are and figure out, like, are we not solving the problems that need to be solved with the current component? Do we need to add a little bit more flexibility here? Should we support a plus moment versus a drop down? Are we finding that users are thinking this is a drop down versus an accordion, using it as a learning moment, having cross communication about what we can change if we need to? Or is this a moment where they weren't aware? Maybe they did not know that there was a component there that supported out of the box that is a part of HTML standards, like Steve mentioned earlier. Let's try to leverage that as much as possible, right? Let's try to take advantage of those DOM elements and the API services that are provided by browsers, and then just add upon there and try to get as much out of the box as we can. Now, knowing that that won't always work and doesn't always work. So how do we expand from there and use this learning moment?
Erik, you mentioned that you are doing design system audits as a separate Figma file for every component group or component families. Could you please elaborate a little bit more into that? Like, who is actually doing that? What's the cadence? How do you perform these sessions? Are you inviting product teams?
Most of the time when it's happening, it'll happen as a workshop and it's part of a core focus, right? For example, we're going to focus on a component that's part of the system. We'll use the modal as an example. We're putting it in our planning for the half and we want to get a good sense across the entire org, which pillars are using this modal and which way, and use that as a workshop file. So we'll either use a Figma or the FigJam file to collect all those instances from each team. That is where I'll take that as my own ownership to bring that over into our component files. I know Figma doesn't have folders, but nested layers to say this was an audit within a particular time frame so that it has a stamp of when we're actually collecting information, because the modal will always change.
Like, and this is open question for everyone, right? For all the speakers. I'm curious to know, like, is this design system audit sessions are actually productive? Do you have any best practices on how to do that in more efficient ways so that people will be engaged? I know that product teams are always busy. Maybe if you have any thoughts on that, please share.
I can jump in if I'll go first this time, and we'll circle back to last. So I find it really productive. You find the moments that work for you. Instead of trying to steal another hour from teams who are already busy in their schedules, ask them to come to design system office hours if you have that. If not, try to meet them at their meetings and their time and try to get that organized. We also have what are called crit sessions. Can we borrow one of those crit sessions and make it a workshop instead? That way we can get people into the same space at the same time. There's not a lot of visibility, cross-functional visibility all the time, right? We're not necessarily working in complete silos, but it gives us that opportunity to have that workshop and provide some lens outside of your team that you may not already be, privy to, right? How can we see how the other side of the marketplace is attacking a particular problem? That's a good moment to do that, because we're looking at, I'm just going to keep using the modal just so we hammer the same example. How is the modal being handled from one part of the product to another? And you may not have known that otherwise. This workshop gives us a good opportunity for others to not only contribute, but learn.
Others? Maybe
the biggest challenge for me with audits has been identifying all the use cases that could not be on the surface necessarily. In our products, there are features that are, for example, enabled only for specific kind of customers or like audiences. And when you're like, usually if you go through every single page, you try to click every single thing and identify these use cases. But sometimes they're not on the surface and you need to use a special link that you might not know about. I haven't been that fortunate of bringing product onto workshops, but what I've been trying to do is conduct an audit first, show them the results, and go around the product organization and engineering. I showed them some preliminary results of the audit that I did and try to tease out whether or not I missed something. When they see something in front of them, it's a little bit easier to tease out, and bring so many people into the same room or a same call is much more challenging in my experience. So I would do like a draft of the audit quickly and then try to collect more information based on that.
Love it. Steve, do you have any interesting practices here? You're muted, Steve.
Thank you. Yeah, I was saying I never do audits with product teams because there's usually too few of me compared to the number of teams, and that would not scale well. This is definitely something like if you're interested in you doing this with your teams, I would always approach it first from the perspective of resources. Because you're looking at the production output of many teams. Design crits is something that needs to be built in within the design team, and it's better if it's a joint responsibility where other designers also chime in, not just the design system team. If you're in a situation where this is expected of you and you realize you don't have the time to do that and build a design system, you'd want to find champions who are convinced by what you're doing, who are able to understand and then explain to others the ins and outs of your design guidelines and token principles and whatnot, so that they can handle that workload with you. But if the resources don't line up, I would not have dedicated audit sessions. I would piggyback on office hours. Office hours are great because so many different processes can use it as a backup when the ideal solution would take too many resources. And I would definitely end up in office hours discussing, is this component the right one? Is it used in the right way? Why is it that we can't do this kind of customization? There's always signals that you can use to improve your documentation, to improve the findability of something, to understand that you actually need to change the API of a component based on the things that are brought up to you.
Love it. So, Steve, you mentioned 3 main ceremonies that design system folks could attend to bring more awareness and get insights from product teams. A quick summary here is that we can always do that offline first, make it as a draft, and then share our learnings with relevant parties. The second one is design system office hours, where you can share updates about the design system and maybe share some of your new learnings that specific product team or specific portfolio created this new AI component that we can reuse and add to the design system. And the third one is the critique session, right? Design critique sessions. I'm curious about the third one. How do you see yourself being integrated into design critique sessions? Are you there to review designs and maybe propose ideas on which components can be utilized? Do you have any learnings there? Open questions to everyone.
Design crits are not necessarily associated with audits. I would share the results because it's important for design system practitioners to gain visibility around the work. I would definitely utilize. What I wanted, we can certainly utilize synchronous methods. For example, when conducting an audit, I would do this first in Confluence or whatever you use, Notion, whatever. So I would do this there in the place where we usually document the materials in our company. Whether or not I'm attending a certain ritual, I would keep it there regardless. I would share a link to this or record a loom that could be more engaging and share with people just to do a quick overview. Here are the findings and call for feedback or something that people can add.
Great. Quick summary of everything we discussed, where exactly design system folks can be integrated into every ceremony. So get insights and share learnings. I see some people added new variations of the accordion component. It would be great if people could also add a link from which webpage URL they took it. I see that the interactive pin is like completely different. It's in blue color. Um, and as we discussed, if there are some inconsistencies, you just need to create some kind of roadmap where you will able to say that, okay, like here are the components that we are working on. Here are the components being actively utilized. And here are some variations on specific products where it's not utilized properly. Or we can replace the custom solution they've created with the component. My question here is, how do you create a roadmap? We can track all these things, right? We can see some inconsistencies here and there. So what is the next step? Are you doing Jira plans? How do you track all of that? I'm curious to know. It's open question for everyone.
Go first.
I see Steve. Steve is
Yeah, I
thinking
mean,
philosophical. Yes.
the core issue here is how you're going to prioritize it. If you just track it, I'm thinking back on what we had at Back Market. At some point, we had 2,000 open issues to consider. Some were critical bugs, and some were just enhancements or ideas. You need to know how you best support the business as the design system team. There are some good frameworks that, for instance, there's an article on the internet about using RICE as a prioritization method for design systems. There's another one from a designer from Agoda called Alexander, and I forgot his last name, but he's written a pretty much in-depth article on how they prioritize at Agoda, with explanations on how they decide on measuring different metrics for prioritization. After you use very simple systems with severity and frequency of an issue, right? So if you have a problem that comes up every other month, you know that this problem is important because it touches a lot of your teams. If you have a problem that is reported once, and then 2 years later, nobody's acted on it, and nobody's talked about it again, then you know that it was neither important because nobody bothered to actually try and fix it, nor frequent because nobody else talked about it. So it's important that you have a way to make the most critical issues stand out, because that backlog usually grows very fast when you start allowing people to comment on what they want to do differently. Or even if you make an audit, then you're going to end up with hundreds of things that you could want to fix. I would always start with that. Anything that is urgent and important or frequent, I would tackle it. I will find resources within the org that can take care of it.
Love it. And I would like to ask the participants, the power of our listeners, to, if they find this article, please share it in the feed down so other people could take a look and read it. Erik, Andrey, do you have any thoughts on prioritization and how to track all this work for the design system team?
My approach has always been to treat the design system as much as possible as a product, not only because it makes sense, but also because it's more convenient to integrate yourselves into the org. It's typically a little bit hard for those who are working on the design system team to fit into the organizational structure in an organic way, because you're always somewhere in between things. When you're following the same processes as product, it helps to simplify prioritization, planning, attending to certain rituals, gaining visibility, and so on. So whatever the rest of the organization uses for prioritization, I would try to be on the same page with them. In my most recent use case, that was product board. The whole org was using product board for collecting insights, for building roadmaps, etc. I would also use product boards for gaining our internal insights, some from customers and some related to the design system, even internal ones. We built a public roadmap in product board that allowed people to vote for components. We published that on our design system website. Product board was super handy for that. Also, we used same RICE, but it was like a modification of a RICE method for prioritization, because it wasn't like always directly applicable to us. So we did RICE and a few other letters. I don't remember those, unfortunately, but it was mostly tailored to the same things as how many teams need that, how severe the issue is, how much impact could it have across the org, the same sort of things that the rest of the org would use for prioritization. So yeah, prioritization is a spot on thing.
Love it. Thank you for sharing. Great. Let's go through some questions. There is one question from Florian. You mentioned accessibility in terms of area tags. Do you see responsibility within design system teams or dev teams? Thank you, Steve, for sharing your response here. It's a shared responsibility. The design system teams can set a standard, show examples, provide extra opinion, but at the end of the day, all devs need to know about accessibility best practices. Let me check if there are any questions. No questions yet. I see more people are sharing their profiles. Thank you for doing that. Let's start with the second component, tabs. So as we discussed, as a part of this design system inventory process, right, you can start with the sitemap to understand the context of the product. And Andrey and others also share some insights that sometimes you need to go deeper into every aspect of the experience and try to click things as much as possible to see all the different states. So now let's dive deeper into tabs. Tabs might be used to navigate between multiple URLs. Tabs are intended as page-level navigation. If you're looking at just switching panels or content, please use segmented control. Here's the preview they have on the Gestalt design system with some variations. In some cases, they have active tab with some kind of updates inside, tab with the counter. And here are the variations of tabs that we were able to find within Pinterest website itself. And I will ask the community if you find any other variations of the same tab component within Pinterest. Please share your screenshots here or use Infa. And speaking of Infa, you can always use this free gift, like $40 off for their premium account with the code INSREFPIN. Okay, let's go back into the tabs. This is much more easier because I see they are all consistent. I couldn't find any inconsistencies here. Any thoughts?
I think this one is interesting. It touches on navigation. And navigation from perspective of engineering teams, especially web, can bring in some unexpected surprises. There can be situations where your tabs control different views that you show in a, like React app, for instance, in a single page app. There can be situations where you're going to navigate. There can be situations where you're going to change the data model that you use to keep the same view. You can end up creating very different behaviors and code logics to build that as an engineer. And that could lead to having multiple components that all have the same UI. And there can be a lot of value in building these UI elements, but then you might need to make these different behaviors because it can be so difficult or so tricky in large teams to make sure that navigation occurs consistently, that you handle the browser history consistently and so on. So that one is, I'm just going to finish on that very quickly. This is a case where auditing with code-based approaches can be interesting, because if you do it with code-based approaches, you might realize that there are some tab items created by your dev team and see that there are just three components using it, right? This navigation tab or this like data management tab or whatever. And you might start seeing these patterns and understand how you should have presented or maybe split the component better on the design side to allow for the flexibility without being non-compliant with the design system.
Andrey?
I can only add that the tab component is indeed, it's not, it could be boring on the surface here because it seems consistent, but the inconsistency could be not necessarily in the like variation of this component, but in the UI pattern. How people apply this component. Do they use tabs for the things that are supposed to be used? So for example, in the description, this recommendation for when to use segmented control instead of tabs. And a lot of times I see people really confused when they need to use tabs versus segmented control versus chips versus select versus anything else. So I think making it really clear for internal customers how tabs are supposed to be used could be a bigger challenge than implementing them consistently.
So how do you solve this kind of issue, Andrey? Is it just by documenting all the different edge cases when you need to actually use another component?
Clear in my practice, the documentation and making sure that your documentation is the most engaging you can make it is the best answer here. Also, ongoing support for your users, providing your documentation with examples from real life to make it very clear when one should be used instead of the other with examples from our products. This is what proved to be helpful. It's also a continuous education because new people will come, they will try to use them the wrong way, they will not read your documentation, so you will keep doing that you will also try to bring this documentation into their life. So now Figma allows actually to open like little browser windows right into your Figma client, which is extremely convenient because you can provide a link to your documentation website. They click right on your component and this little window pops up. This minimizes the friction of getting this information. But yeah, on my experience, no silver bullet.
Love it. So you touched on three things: showing real life examples, creating some kind of educational materials, making sure that new people who are joining the product teams are actually aware of this kind of variations.
This basically becomes, we're not necessarily need to go into like design system onboarding, but there is design system onboarding, right? And learning about these common use cases, or maybe even identifying the most common inconsistencies that you identify. What are your people like most struggling with? These are the things you can highlight, like emphasize in your educational materials and onboarding to the design system.
Love it. Steve?
When you build components, if you want them built right, you need to have engineers in the room, specifically the engineers who are responsible for the architecture of your application. Because they're the ones who are going to know the constraints of a tech stack, and maybe you have integrations with third-party technologies and use cases with tabs or segmented controls where, well, actually it perfectly makes sense that tabs are for navigation and segmented controls for data. But in this specific use case, because of a specific technical depth that you have or integration with a third party, you need to do something different from a technical standpoint. And I'm going to draw a parallel with button and link. Button looks like a link, but you can be assured that many link-looking buttons and button-looking links exist in code because they just have to for a variety of reasons. So it's important to understand the technical constraints in your product and to build around them or accommodate for them, rather than produce something, ask for feedback, and just expect it to work without knowing the other side of the equation.
Love it. Thank you for sharing. Steve, like taking a look from like engineering perspective, right? If we will take a look into code previews, do you have any insights here? Because sometimes we can see that the class names are same, right? In some cases, it's not. But maybe it's because of the depth of the component that we didn't go deep enough into the same level as those components based on the screenshots, right? What are your thoughts here based on the code preview?
This is the rendered code rather than the code that was written, and I don't think it's something that we can exploit to understand what's happening. These class names, for instance, they're generated by some kind of styling tool, and it's very likely that they're not the same from one page to the other. So if you take these two tabs that are on the same page, they might be the same. We can see that the first one and the second one here are the same, but it might change for reasons that have nothing to do with the code being different. This is really not something that you can use as an indicator. The approach to understand what's different in the code is to use static analysis tools, where you can read all the code and reconstruct which component is calling which component with what options. And you can then start counting, and you can start counting which options are always used, which ones are used only in some cases. And if you can extract these different bits of code, you can see what is being done differently by the engineers without all this noise added on later on by how it's translated by your build tools.
Do you have any examples for static analysis tools, like any frameworks?
This is something that you build based on your tech stack. Because at the end of the day, if you really don't know what to use, Acorn is great, like what the squirrels eat. Esprime is great as well, but there are many options. It usually depends if you're on Remix, React, Vue, and whatnot. You're not going to use the same tools. Just from the output code, for instance, we can see the ARIA current page. This is completely normal. This means that it's the link that is being selected. The fact that some of them have an href or not, we don't really know how it's built. The ones that don't have an href, there's probably still something happening if we click them. But this is not something that we can use on our own to understand what's going on.
Erik, do you have any thoughts? We spoke a lot.
No, I think as Steve was saying, just looking at this from a high level, it's kind of hard to understand what's going on here, not knowing the depth of these codes and class names, but we can see each one of these examples has the class AKY and V92 So there's a pattern there that's being adopted, but in some cases may be wrapped in something else additional for maybe additional spacing, something else that is just a slight variation that isn't quite being solved with that tab. That might be a moment to understand more about what these patterns are and how they're changing.
Love it. I also saw one interesting example from IBM for their carbon design system. They are adding additional parameter to the generated code. So the class names here, this is the optimization, right? So decrease the amount of package that will be shared to the end user. But if you would like to understand if it's your component or not, I've seen that IBM, they are using component ID parameter or component name. So you will able to quickly see from the code preview that it's being used from the design system. Another practice is to add abbreviations. If your design system is called Gestalt design system, you can add GDS as abbreviation to your class name to highlight and show that it's from your design system. If within your organization you have multiple design systems, like I was working with one where they had like 7 design systems. So this kind of abbreviation truly helped to understand like which of the design system they used before.
I just want to caution here on this specifically. There are some contexts, if you work in retail, if you work in media, where performance is absolutely essential, and you don't want to make your pages heavier, to add metadata that you use for testing or for auditing. This is something that you do in what's called the development build of your application, where your developers are running it locally and they have all this information available. But you should not request your engineers to add metadata in production on every single component instance. And if you do that, they will probably not be happy at all, and they will not agree. And there will be someone higher up who will say, no, this designer people, they're crazy. They don't understand what they're doing. And this will cause friction. It's really important to understand that nowadays performance is key. Performance drives revenue by a large margin, and we don't want to make anything heavier than it needs to be. We really don't. So this is something that you need to approach from the perspective of your development environment or your pre-production environment if you have one, but not your production environment. That is not a reasonable request to make.
Erik, any thoughts?
Yeah, I love that. And it's finding that moment, what every design system wants to talk about, and that's adoption metrics. But finding those ways to understand those adoptions, maybe in that pre-prod moment. I love that.
I just checked the time, and unfortunately, we are out of time. It went so fast, so many insights. I will synthesize all the insights and we'll put it into our feedback board and we'll share as email follow-up so that if the session, you can take a look into all the insights that we were able to generate. We also added some more component groups: search guide, badge, banner callout, avatar, switch. If you want to dive deeper and continue, you can just add screenshots right there.